Hello, everybody, and welcome to Expert Tactics and Strategies for Creating a Forever Revenue Stream. We are going to cover a bunch of really good information, do a really good Q&A session. Speaking of questions, please put them in the question or the chat box, and we'll follow up with your questions most likely at the end just to make sure that we get through all of the slides and all of the questions that we're going to answer from the audience that have been asked before the webinar. We're also going to be recording, so you'll get the recording after, as well as some follow-up materials that kind of special. There's going to be a chapter 8 that we're going to be sending out from Robbie's new book, and some other materials that I think you'll find really engaging and useful. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in once I click on the slide. All right, so who am I? I'm Alicia. I'm the Director of Demand Generation here at Recurly. And then we have our super special guest. Robbie is with us. Robbie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for the last almost 20 years, I've been focused on studying and working with subscription and membership models. I've worked with over 100 different organizations in over 20 different industries. But all around building a forever promise with the people that they serve. And I've written 2 books, The Membership Economy, which came out 5 years ago, and The Forever Transaction, which just came out last month.
That's very exciting. So Robbie is a subject matter expert when it comes to subscriptions and building a successful business. So really excited to hear what she has to say and to have her share with you. All right, so quick agenda. So we've already done the introductions. We're going to cover a few different things today. First is the keys to success in the membership economy. And then we're going to jump right into strategies and advice for every stage business. So we're going to cover launching a business, scaling a business, and leading or optimizing a business. And then run through some key takeaways and do Q&A. Like I said, we'll be answering some questions throughout that have come in from the audience beforehand, but then doing a Q&A session at the end. So definitely type in your questions into the chat box. All right, so there's a lot of reasons that we're talking about this topic today. One is there's just there's a lot of noise in the market. There's a lot of volatility. There's a lot of change that people are dealing with right now. And overall, it just takes more to succeed. So in my career as a marketer, I've always found it super helpful to have advice and leadership and mentorship from others who have been there, done that. So that's kind of why we're talking about this today and why Robbie's here to share some information. Robbie, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this topic. Can you tell us a little bit more about why now and talk us through this slide a little bit?
Yeah, so 5 years ago when I wrote Membership Economy, I had to explain, people weren't seeing what I was seeing. I was seeing that subscription was a really powerful thing that could be used for almost any kind of business or nonprofit, frankly, and to drive recurring revenue, to build deeper relationships with customers, and that it required having some kind of a core forever promise. And people weren't seeing it. 5 years later, it's everywhere, right? The world seems to have caught up and everybody is doing subscriptions. And this slide, every logo on this slide represents an organization that is investing in subscriptions and building memberships, long-term relationships with the people that they serve. And you can see that it's everything from consumer products to media to software to hardware to heavy equipment. I mean, for goodness sake, Burger King is on this chart, right? They have a subscription. So it's just important for context setting that, to just understand that consumers and B2B customers really understand subscriptions now, and they have certain expectations when it comes to what a subscription model should deliver.
And I think that definitely ties into the overall conversation around that you and I have had around like having a North Star, being able to provide value from the onset and then throughout the tenure of a subscriber. All right, so Tell us about this because this definitely looks like a really fancy flow chart.
Oh, it's very fancy. I love I love fancy charts. Um, I made this to talk about some of the areas for organizations here. This kind of gets into the nitty gritty of what makes a good subscription model
Mhm,
and what an organization, one of the biggest challenges, and I'm sure you see this at Recurly too, is that organizations kind of put the cart before the horse sometimes and say, we're going to be a subscription business.
mhm,
And so we're just going to put some subscription pricing on whatever we have and kind of hope for the best, hope our
mhm,
customers move along with us.
mhm,
And it really takes a little more than that. An organization, it starts in the middle with putting the customer at the center of everything you do and making sure that you have product market fit, not just that headline benefit that gets people to sign up for the subscription, but also what are the engagement benefits that are going to get someone to make your subscription a habit? What are the
mhm,
benefits that you offer them that kind of bring them deeper into your world where they say, I joined for this, but I stay for that. Um,
mhm,
and then, then you kind of look around these 7 steps. You want to make sure that you have the right organization, that you have the right, kind of metrics at your organization, that everybody's on the same dashboard, focusing on the same goals, that you have, people that understand the value of retention and engagement, as well as, traditional, transactional mindset. You want to have, uh, people who understand that in the membership economy, the moment of transaction, usually it's like awareness, trial, purchase, and then you go back up to the top and you get somebody to engage again. In
mhm,
the membership economy, that moment of transaction is really the starting point for where you have to be really thoughtful about building that relationship. You really
mhm,
have to think about what happens after they buy. And that's where, your funnel really expands again as you deepen and extend the nature of that relationship. Pricing, number 3, I always say, you want to keep your pricing as simple as possible and no simpler. That may mean that it's very complex on your side, but for the customer, they should be able to feel like they trust that the way it's priced makes sense for them and that they don't have to become experts on your pricing model.
mhm,
Freemium and free, what is the role of free in your business model? There's a difference between a free trial and freemium. Free trial is a taste of the best thing you have to offer. Freemium is like a hamburger forever. It's good enough. It's good enough. It's not the best thing you have, but it will fill them up. And
mhm,
organizations I found, can really benefit by thinking about, do I need a free trial here because they don't understand what the value is or they don't believe it's as good as I say? Or do they need freemium, which is really about slowly changing their habits over time and proving to them that they're going to make this part of their new normal before they're willing to pay? Or
mhm,
because there's a viral effect, that is the people that are free touch people who are willing to pay, or a network effect, meaning the people that are free are actually part of the product, create more value for the people who pay. Onboarding and customer success kind of, for me, always go hand in hand. Onboarding is about choreographing those first seconds, minutes, days after somebody decides to join you and
mhm,
helping them to discover the value that they're already paying for and create new habits so that they take off their consumer hat, put on their member hat, and stop looking for alternatives. They say, your organization is the way I'm going to solve my problem or achieve my goal, and I don't need to keep shopping.
mhm,
Customer success is continuing with that mindset after the onboarding experience, making sure that your customers are getting the value they're paying for. Because
mhm,
if they're not using your product, even if your product is phenomenal, they're going to cancel. And
mhm,
so it's up to you as an organization to make sure people are using the products they're paying for. And that's what customer success is really all about. And
mhm,
then finally, technology, and I'm kind of giving a little nod to Recurly here, technology has advanced so much. 5 years ago when I was, writing my first book, and even before that, so much of this had to be bespoke. It was really hard to, subscription billing and to manage the relationship and extend the
mhm,
relationship and present new offers. It was so hard. And now the
mhm,
technology is there. So there's really no excuse for an organization to say, we can't do subscription because the
mhm,
technology is too hard. Or as one client said to me, yeah, this is a great idea. This will definitely put subscription on our 5-year plan. This is what the IT department said.
mhm,
And we'll get back to you in, at the time, 2023. This
Mm-hmm.
was in 20. But really, it's the responsibility of everyone in the organization to be proactively thinking about what can be done that's being done manually now, or
Mm-hmm.
in a non-scalable way that could be done with the technology. So those
Mm-hmm.
7 things, I've kind of shared a bunch of things and just kind of scratched the surface, but these are the ways that you can really, turbocharge a subscription model.
Mm-hmm. Are there specific areas within these 7 things that you see most often as like the gap, or where companies could put more effort toward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one where, like, kind of the low-hanging fruit that's almost always the best place to start is onboarding.
Mm-hmm.
That, a lot of times people are so excited to get a new customer that they just kind of leave them and go run back out and get more. I always joke, like, in the software as a service world, in enterprise software, which I did when I was early in my career, sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
felt like the salespeople, it was like they were big game hunters and they would go out to find the woolly mammoth, and then they'd get one and they'd bring it and they'd drag it back to the cave floor and then leave it for the rest of the team to deal with while they went back out on another hunt. And
Mm-hmm.
that onboarding period, that transition from, I bought it to I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
use it, is
Mm-hmm.
where we lose most of our customers, right? They
Mm-hmm.
buy it and they're like, oops, I think I made a mistake, or, oh, I'm not getting value, or, oh, I don't understand, or this isn't for me. And then
Mm-hmm.
they leave. So I would say that's
Mm-hmm.
probably the biggest opportunity. Um, Another really big one is really understanding what is the role of freemium,
Mm-hmm.
and free trials. And I think some organizations overgive, they give too much away, to
Mm-hmm.
the point where even the free trial, people are like, I don't need to pay for it because I got everything I needed in the free trial or in the freemium offer. Or on the other side, not even exploring how free could add value to the overarching model. Those would probably be the
Mm-hmm.
2 areas. Yeah. What do you think?
I think that I 100% agree with the onboarding thought. I think that there's a whole new role that has been created to address onboarding, and that loyalty is not necessarily the word, but adoption, really
Mhm.
driving adoption. Because I use the treadmill analogy all the time. It's like, yeah, great, you bought that treadmill, but like now it's your clothes hanger. So it's a
Yeah.
similar type of thing. I 100% agree there. And I
Yeah.
think that, yeah, there's a lot of room in freemium, and then hands down pricing, because pricing can get really complicated on the front end. So I think I'm in that lower quadrant with you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you brought up the treadmill. I have a Peloton, which I love. I'm not getting paid to say that. I just love it so much. Um, and they're having a moment right now, during this
Mhm,
COVID time. And I think part of it is, um, that the onboarding experience is, they've really thought a lot about, like you said, adoption and engagement.
mhm,
It's, once you buy it, because like with the treadmill, you're like, okay, now I have it, but I don't feel motivated to get on it. But with the
mhm,
Peloton, there's the Peloton community. You can link
mhm,
in with your friends so they can ride with you. And they've kind of built on that, and you can track your own progress.
mhm,
So thinking really hard about not just what is that headline benefit that gets people to join, but
mhm,
what kind of behavior is going to make them stay is so important.
100%, 100%. So let's talk a little bit more specifically around the 3 stages. So
Yeah.
I know you've got a lot of thoughts on launch. Like, I'd love to hear, like, tell me all of the things.
Okay. So when I wrote, this new book, I have to just do this. My publicist makes me, the Forever Transaction. I divided it. I divided it into 3 parts: launch, scale, lead. And the first phase, because these are kind of the 3 phases you go through when you're growing your subscription business. The first phase is like,
Mhm,
just how do we get started?
mhm,
And there, what I'd advise is, number one, you want to make sure you have the resources that you're going to need to fully get through the experimental phase.
mhm,
Um, you need the right people on your team. You need the right leader. If you're an entrepreneur inside a larger organization, you need that kind of uh, senior leader who's going to be your sponsor and who's going to gather the people and kind of carry the torch. Um,
mhm,
you need money, of course, but also you need time. You need runway to experiment,
mhm,
and you need to set expectations with leadership that you're not going to get it right the first time, and that you're going to be continually iterating, and that the revenue is going to be small at first, because that's how subscriptions work.
Mhm.
So you really need to set expectations and make sure you have support. Then you get into the nitty gritty, where you need to define what I call a forever promise, and know who you're making it to, who's your best member that you're going to optimize your membership for.
Mhm.
And I always say, like, if you're a going concern, your best member is probably the person who currently has the greatest lifetime value, or the profile of the person who uses your products and services really well, is willing to pay for them,
Mhm.
and is getting a lot of value, because that's the person that's going to keep staying with you and trusting you to solve the full problem, as opposed to somebody who's using you for one small feature that you happen to have.
Mhm.
And what is the promise? What is the bigger goal that they have that they wish you'd promise, right? So if it's a
Mhm.
newspaper, their promise might be to help their members understand the world around them and make better
Mhm.
decisions, right? So you
Mhm.
can already see, like, yeah, print newspaper is great for that, but there's a million other ways they could layer in value over time. So you want to
Mhm.
have that promise be kind of big enough and juicy enough that you can keep
Mhm.
going. And then you want to, tinker with different features, so you get your product market fit. And again, product market fit needs to be attractive enough to get someone to sign up, but
Mhm.
also sticky enough to make it a habit.
Mhm. Mhm. I want to dig into that identify your best member real quick,
Mhm.
because I think that there's a couple of questions around that. In marketing, I think of this as an ICP. It's your ideal customer profile. Is
Mhm.
that how you're thinking about that? And then what are like a couple of things that someone can do to start really identifying who that person is that their ideal target is?
Yeah, it's very much like an ICP. I think the important thing to keep in mind in this situation is you really need to think about them in terms of their journey, and what their goal is. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just the profile of what they look like, but it's also that goal that they have that is kind of a long-standing goal. So for example, if I were, let's say, baby center, right? Of course my target is new moms, but
Mm-hmm.
it's particularly, let's say, moms who really are caring about their kids' health, and who are likely to stay with us and want to continue to learn and grow along with their child,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it adds
Mm-hmm.
that element. And the way that I, help organizations figure out who their best member is,
Mm-hmm.
one of the best little tricks is, take your existing customers and have a discussion with colleagues and say, okay, who are some of our best customers? And just write their names down.
Mm-hmm.
And then say, and who are our not best customers? And write their names down. If you know who they are, if you're at the level like where you have like kind of
Mm-hmm.
customers that or, if you don't know their names, write profiles like, oh yeah, the ones that do this or the ones that do that. And you
Mm-hmm.
start to look at the two in relief, and you say, oh, I'm starting to understand the difference between a best and a not best member.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really where kind of the magic happens. You start to say, oh, I get it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they are not a best customer if they have this thing. So like back to the, let's say the baby center example.
Mm-hmm.
It might be, well, if they're a new mom, but they already have a child, they've probably established their habits, and it's going to be a lot harder. They're not going to be as interested in bonding with other moms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they've already,
Mm-hmm.
usually you bond with the parents of the first kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
The friends of
Mm-hmm.
the first kid, not the second kid. Or like in the world of, video content, the best members are the ones usually who can, attach the app to their big screen TV. Because if you're watching the sports events on your teeny tiny screen,
Mm-hmm.
you may not enjoy it as much as if you're able to watch it with your, family and friends. So understanding those things, and you can start to identify the differences between both who those people are and what their behavior is, especially early on, which
Mm-hmm.
allows you to both define this is our best member, and
Mm-hmm.
also start optimizing the features for that person.
Okay, great points. Great points. And I guess even before, or maybe it's in tandem, when you're developing what I'm going to call your ICP, how do I know when to launch? Like, how do I get started? How do I know when to launch? Are there any tips like for when knowing when to move to a subscription model?
Yeah. So knowing, so the simple answer to knowing when to move to a subscription model, like before, like there's sort of two places, right? When do you know when you're ready to launch in the market? Which has to do with, testing and experimentation and, defining, and there's lots of different ways you can do that. But the bigger question, I think, which you're raising, Alicia, is if I'm an organization sitting on the sidelines, how do I know if subscription's for me? And what I would say there is, if sales and marketing matter in your organization, if your customers have other alternatives to what you offer, you probably want to be thinking about subscription. So if you have a product where they have no choice anyway, you're the last gas for 100 miles, you are the only one that makes the medicine that keeps me alive, you sell fish at a market for a commodity price, and you own a fleet of fishing boats, you don't really need a subscription, because those purchases are going to happen whether or not you are member centric, whether or not you have automatic payments. They're going to find you. But for the rest of us, the ones who are really depending on our relationships and building trust with our customers, this is a great way to deepen the relationship with the best customers, which results in more profitable revenue, more predictable revenue. Going direct to the customer is a big reason that a lot of companies move to subscription, to kind of bypass the middleman, whether that's a retailer or a distributor or a dealer or cable company. They want to go direct to their end customer. There's all kinds of benefits. Also, you can get a multiple of 5 to 7x valuation versus what you can get as a kind of traditional business.
Okay, I think that those are good points, and I have a lot more questions, but
okay.
For the sake of time, I'm going to skip to the next slide, and then we'll come back around.
Okay,
so,
we could talk all day, I'm sure.
I know. So we've gone through some of the key things for launch. What about scaling? I already have a business, and I'm trying to really scale and meet that next step.
Yeah. So scale is, you've got your, as you said, you've got your product market fit. You've experimented a little bit. You're like, okay, I got lightning in a bottle. This is working. What do I do next? So these are the steps that are usually really tricky for organizations. The first one is you want to have a different kind of culture for a membership organization. If you want to have subscription revenue, you need to focus on the long-term relationship, and everything needs to be built around that. A lot of organizations, in contrast, have what I would call a product-centric focus, or they have a sales-centric focus or a revenue focus, which is like quarterly capitalism. Are we going to hit our number? So transforming, that's what that chapter 8 is that we're going to share with our audience, where I get into more detail on this. But you want to kind of take the organization along and get them to buy into this new way of doing things. You also need to build out your infrastructure. What are the processes that the organization will use? A lot of times when you're just experimenting, you're kind of using chewing gum and paper clips and Excel spreadsheets to hold together your model. And you get to a point where like, this is working. Let's invest in an infrastructure. And that means, what kind of technology are we going to use? How are we going to automate some of these processes? Can we put in some, machine learning or artificial intelligence to, allow us to automatically make better decisions and get smarter about our customers? So that's a big part of this phase, is really, and you kind of need an operator in this phase. Like, the first phase is really more of like an entrepreneurial type or an innovator. This is the phase where you need somebody who's like, I understand process, I understand infrastructure, setting the standards for the dashboard, and then being willing to continually, evolve the offering, having that as part of your, process. And finally, I talk a little bit in the book about, does it make sense to just acquire your way into scale by buying a business that is already doing subscription well, and what the pros and cons are there, which is, one way that organizations have been able to grow really fast.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that yet. I have a question around scaling, but it also speaks to some of the things within launching. And it's around like some of the really critical considerations and like best practices. Are there things that you would suggest, like creating a committee or something along those lines to achieve this goal?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I call it the right who for the how, is what you you know. And I think in the first phase, you need the CEO buy-in, or your
Mhm,
investor buy-in, depending if you're starting
mhm,
out or whatever. Um, and then you need a team of people. At the beginning, you need a certain set of skills. You need brainstormers. You need
mhm,
people who can create things on the fly. You need research.
mhm,
Um, you need somebody who really understands the customer really well. Um, then you need, in that next phase, you really need operators. You need somebody that understands, technology. You need someone who can kind of build something out. Um, and so you kind of need different skills. And then you need kind of the involvement. I don't want to say necessarily of HR, but you need to figure out,
mhm,
how are we going to roll this out? How are we going to build support and understanding? Because
mhm,
a lot of, one of the things I've seen with longtime businesses when they move to subscription is that everybody in the company kind of feel like, especially lower down, they're like, well, this is just like the idea du jour of the leadership team, that now we're a membership business. So I'll just
mhm,
use the lingo that they use, but I'm just going to keep doing my job the way I always did it. And
mhm,
if they don't understand why you're doing it, it's really hard to bring them along, and it's really hard to kind of build momentum.
mhm. Yeah, and I found that to be true in any type of change management. It's that socialization angle where it's you bring people in early and then often, and you have to like show them what's in them for them, like what's the value to them.
Such a good
Um,
point.
I found that super helpful in any initiative. So I imagine that's very much the same here.
Yeah, it's such a good point. It is exactly the same as any organizational transformation. A lot of the issues in the scale phase are very much like you said. It's, how do you bring people along? How do you build trust with your colleagues?
Mhm,
How do you phase things in such a way that you don't risk rocking the boat of the existing business, and,
mhm,
risking the trust of your existing customers? I think that's a really important point, that having that skill in organizational transformation is critical.
mhm, mhm. What about, if I'm in the scaling phase, what about optimizing any acquisition efforts to scale faster or for optimizing revenue? Do you have any thoughts around those?
Do you mean acquisition of another company or acquisition of customers?
I would say acquisition of customers.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that, there needs to always be a balance between acquisition and retention.
Mhm,
And I encourage companies not to turn on their acquisition loudspeaker until they know that retention works. So that's why
mhm,
scale is exactly the place where this kind of comes up, is,
mhm,
okay, we know this works. We know who our best member is.
mhm,
Um, Now it's time to acquire them. I think, um, it's important to track your acquisitions by cohort and
mhm,
compare them. So, if some are coming through referral and others are coming through different ad campaigns, and maybe others are coming through, doing some kind of a search on a certain keyword, you
mhm,
want to know not just how many are coming from each of those sources, but how long are those people staying? And are there
mhm,
differences, whether it's by acquisition source, time of year, kind of calendar time of year, offer
mhm,
presented? What are the differences, so that you can start to get smart about which cohorts of members are the best, and how to
mhm,
replicate those best practices as you scale?
mhm, mhm. Okay, I think that that makes sense. And then if we flip it to the other side, what about, you mentioned, you kind of led to this already, but what about that current base that you have? How do I protect our
Yeah.
current base and continue to provide engagement with them through offerings to really drive that loyalty?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's such a hard balance between acquisition and retention. And what I found is, a lot of times new organizations that are just getting started, so let's say a lot of SaaS companies here, in Silicon Valley, where we both are,
Hmm.
they tend to be very acquisition biased. They love, showing their growth. They love showing, their growth hacking. They love showing their new logos if they're B2B. Um,
Hmm.
and they tend to neglect engagement and retention. That is, how do we get this to expand across the organization? How do we get people to make using our media, their habits. So, in those cases, I'd say, the opportunity for them is to focus more on engagement and retention, which is recency, frequency, depth, and breadth of usage. If you can track that. On the other hand, a lot of long-standing businesses, and we're going to get into that with the lead phase, their issue is they often have very, very loyal members that they really pay a lot of attention to. But new members aren't coming. They're not joining. This is like newspapers and sometimes, gyms and professional associations where they say things like, Gen Zs or millennials, they just aren't joiners. And it's not that they're not joiners, it's that they're just not compelled by this offering. So they need to focus more on acquisition. So I sometimes say, use your microscope, which is like to look at what's happening today, today's members, making sure they're happy and engaged, and use your telescope to look out on the horizon and say, what's the next frontier? What's the next offering we should have? How do we stay relevant for tomorrow's cohort?
Okay, great points. And then alongside all of these, or kind of underlying it, is the foundation. So we talked about the infrastructure, but what about metrics? Like, are there specific metrics that somebody should be looking for, and are there different metrics for somebody in SaaS versus D2C, or a different industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole set of metrics that are really critical for any kind of business that's trying to build a forever promise with their customers, whether it's SaaS or heavy equipment or media or news, whatever. And it's about, kind of back to our last point, it's about balancing acquisition with, the lifetime value. You want to manage for churn. And so there's a lot of metrics around that. You want to measure what is the cost of acquisition versus the lifetime value of the customer, which is a little bit different. You can spend a lot more money to acquire a customer if they're going to stay a long time. If a customer is going to, if it's $10 a month and they're going to stay for somewhere between like 36 and 40 months, right? That's a, $360 to $400. You might be willing to spend $100 to acquire that person, right? A 3-to-1 ratio is still pretty great. So it's really important that you track what is the lifetime value of the customer, which is, a lot of organizations don't go there because it's hard. And then you need to know what is the expected retention of a new member? How long are they going to stay? And is that relationship going to expand or contract over time if you have, different tiers of membership or different elements of membership that they can go deeper or lighter in? So those are important. You want to track, people track, monthly average revenue, monthly recurring revenue, annual recurring revenue, obviously churn. I encourage them to go one step beyond that and track things like engagement. What features are they using? How often and when? What is the last feature that someone uses in the freemium model before they upgrade? So in other words, understanding what drives conversion. Those are some of the other things that I think people don't think about as much when it comes to what metrics should we be looking at on our dashboard. And of course, loyalty is, kind of the biggest, kind of overall metric of, understanding, something like Net Promoter Score or willingness to refer or, how they feel about your brand. Those are also really important qualitative metrics to understand kind of the connection that you have with your best customers.
It's a very, and someone might correct me for this, but it's very marketing mindset. These are everything that you just talked about are all the things that I typically measure. CAC, LTV, all of these things. It's surprising to me how much alignment there is between the two, really. So
yeah, well, it's really funny. I mean, something, Alicia, that is interesting is it's very natural. You're right. It's the whole idea of subscription is very appealing and natural to marketers. But in order for the model to be successful, the rest of the organization also needs to change their behaviors. And I think that's often very hard for us as marketers. So for example, if you're a news organization, it's not just about moving from, advertising model to reader revenue, I think they call it model, right? Where you have subscription.
Mhm.
You also have to change the content, because the kind of content that drives eyeballs is
Mhm.
not necessarily the kind of content that people are willing to pay for. So you
Mhm.
actually might need to change your article from what Kim Kardashian's doing with her kids this week to, trends in the bond market. You know,
Mhm.
you might have a much smaller
Quite the
audience
shift.
for the latter, right? Fewer people are going to click on it, but the people who click on
Mhm.
that article, they're
Mhm.
likely to be willing to pay for detailed, thoughtful financial news.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, but that's a product issue. That's not a marketing question. That's a product question.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
and that's just one example. Same thing with, technology, right? If you have a great subscription, but it's clunky and it's hard for somebody to access, it's hard for them to use it, or it's hard for them to pay, or it's hard for them to pause or cancel. Um,
Mhm.
that's not a marketing issue. That's a product or a technology
Mhm.
issue. So the tech team
Mhm.
needs to be involved. The product team needs to be involved. The
Mhm.
finance team needs to be involved. The investor relations team needs to be involved, because they need to be able to communicate how a subscription works differently from
Mhm.
a different kind of business model. So
Mhm.
while I think it's really organic and often the marketing team's on the vanguard of the subscription movement, it's
Mhm.
really important culturally to bring everybody along.
100%. 100% agree. So when we talk about bringing others along, so if you're leading, you've already brought
Yeah,
others along in
yeah,
theory. Um, like what's next? So for these bigger businesses, like where do you go?
yeah. So, the lead phase is for those businesses, and I listed some of them in the bottom that have been doing subscription or membership for a long time.
Mhm.
And now their question is, how do you stay relevant when there's new options being introduced, copycats, but also maybe better ways of doing it, coming from, a different direction? And how do you, there's the temptation to take shortcuts, right? To say,
Mhm.
oh man, we have these really, really loyal members and we're not going to hit our number. Let's charge them for some kind of fee. They won't notice because they trust us so much. Let's raise our prices because they won't notice.
Mhm.
So sort of taking a shortcut to hit your goal, which then, kind of destroys your brand equity. Um,
Mhm.
that's something, or making it hard to cancel. That's another way to, people will say, oh, if you add 2 more screens to the cancel sequence,
Mhm.
you can increase lifetime value by 1 month. So let's do that. That's a 10% increase. So you want to resist that. You want to stay forever young. So make sure that tomorrow's members are finding your offer credible, in addition to today's members being loyal. So
Mhm.
when people stop buying your subscription, it's usually a sign that your offering is no longer relevant or competitive. And
Mhm.
usually that's because you haven't kept pace with your promise. So in other words, you
Mhm.
designed something that delivered in the best way on your promise several years ago. Members like it, so you've stopped innovating. And then when a new person comes and looks, they're like, this isn't that interesting. There's, other companies have moved past this. That's where I'm going to go. Um,
Mhm.
and then, as we talked about before, you really want to look out on the horizon in terms of new technologies, in terms of new geographies. A lot of really interesting things are happening with subscription outside of the United States. Um,
Mhm.
and they're both creating their own subscriptions, and they're also adopting, we're seeing like Netflix in India, which is designed for mobile, and I think it's like $3 a month. It's a totally different way of delivery. What does that mean for your subscription? What do you see, not just with your microscope that looks at today's members and today's offerings, but what is tomorrow going to look like?
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, I think that that's some really sound advice for businesses who have, to your point, had been in business or have had a subscription business for a long time to really stay relevant and continue to deliver value, and just resist, like you're saying, those shortcuts because they're not actually going to return in the long run for you. It's very short-sighted wins. So, um, along those lines, and I think it's, if you've done some of those tactics or you have people who have canceled. I know churn is a big topic within every space pretty much, but specifically this one. So let's talk about strategies for win back and save offerings. Like, what's your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So the first thing is you don't want to get to that point. And that sounds funny, but like a lot of
Yes, it's
businesses,
true.
they're like, okay, acquisition, check, retention,
Mhm.
and it's like in between there's nothing. So the first
Mhm.
thing you want to do is invest in engagement, and you can do that through product features, through the user experience, but you can also do that through external means, through customer success,
Mhm.
and also through communication, through email or texting or calls, to
Mhm.
communicate, noticing when behavior changes in a negative way and
Mhm.
intervening early, not waiting until the 30 days before renewal,
Mhm.
or waiting until they call and threaten to cancel. If you
Mhm.
wait until they call to threaten to cancel and then give them a better offer, what that does is it educates your members that they should call and threaten to cancel so they can get a better price. And what you're saying as a company is, our best customers are people who call and threaten. Those are the people we treat the best.
Mhm.
So if you want to be treated the best by us, call and threaten us.
Mhm.
And of course, nobody really wants that. Um, so I would say you want to be really careful about what offers you give at the moment of cancellation. So I would err on the side of saying it's better to say, okay, if this option isn't good for you, why don't you drop down a tier, to
Mhm.
our lower tier, rather than saying we'll continue giving you what you got, but we see that you don't value it, so we're going to give you a better price. Um,
Mhm.
so that's one thing about retention. Another thing that's very popular right now is the pause button, which gives customers an opportunity, to say, look, I don't want to pay for this right now, either because, especially in times of COVID, I don't have the income that I've had before, and so I need to cut
Mhm.
down, but I hope to come back, or because I'm so busy that I'm not making use of the value that I get from you. But there will be a time
Mhm.
when I need it again, like, oh, I'm too busy to watch Netflix. Pause. I'll
Mhm.
come back in 2 months. So pause is really popular. And then in terms of win backs, um,
Mhm.
it's really important to understand why they left in the first place to know how to win them back. So if I leave because your product's no longer relevant to me, it's going to be very hard to win me back. If I leave because your technology is not working very well, or I've used up all of your content, you
Mhm.
might try to win me back when you fix the problem or added the content, right? To say, hey, come back, we now have expert content, or hey, come back, now we have integrations with these other technologies, or hey, come back, remember how you were watching the soccer final and it conked out on you? We've fixed our technology, so it's 99.99% uploaded, or
Mhm.
up, not uploaded. So I think those are ways to win people back with a specific communication that the problem that lost them in the first place has been solved, or
Mhm.
asking them if their situation has changed.
Mhm.
So maybe you canceled the news because you didn't think you needed it, but oh boy, COVID's here and I need to read the news. This might be a good time to win people back because they trusted you enough to read your content before they know the value. And now's a moment when it's very likely that they need news more than ever.
Yeah, 100%. I think that there's something that's underlying, maybe underlying it, maybe that's not the wrong word to use, but it's that topic of agility. And I think that that goes into your third point around inoculating yourself from subscription fatigue. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit, and especially given current state of the world, how companies can remain agile, and if there's things that they should be doing right now so that they can kind of build that into their processes or be reevaluating their offering?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now we're having a moment. In times of great change, consumers and customers have to change their behaviors. So a
Hmm.
lot of subscription businesses are actually seeing a big spike in usage.
Hmm.
New customers coming in, existing customers going deeper and demanding more from the organization. So it's a great
Hmm.
time to iterate and evolve what you're offering to continue to use that North Star of your customers' needs as a way to evolve and change. It's not a
Hmm.
great, if you take advantage of the moment and raise your prices, which can be tempting, that's going to have an impact on consumer trust. I think subscription fatigue comes either when there's not a product market fit, when you're being forced to subscribe to something that you'd rather own,
Hmm.
for example, or when the subscription isn't justified by the offer. Um, Or when there's subscription guilt, which is, the product's great, but I don't use it enough, and so I feel bad about myself, like what happens with the New Yorker or Blue Apron when the food's going bad in your fridge, and you're like, that's my fault for not eating it, but it still feels bad, so I'll cancel. And then also the biggest culprit in subscription fatigue that I hear all the time when I tell people I'm a subscription expert is hiding the cancel button. Organizations that make it hard to get out of subscriptions, especially now when people have really valid reasons for needing to pause, leave such a bad taste in the mouths of customers. And ultimately, in the long term, it's bad for the organizations as well, because those people are very unlikely to ever return, and they're pretty likely to badmouth the organization as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot of information. And I know that, we're coming up on some time restrictions. So I want to kind of go through some key takeaways and then any last thoughts that we might have. And we have one question I want to address.
Okay.
So if I'm thinking about the key takeaways, putting this together before this, throughout the conversations that we've had, it seems like the most important metric is really your loyalty score. Everything you're building towards is to really drive engagement through your onboarding, through your customer success, through your product. That's really what you're working towards, so you can avoid those cancellations, having to do those win backs like you were saying. And some of the key ways that you can do that is to really identify your ICP, which is that membership profile, and start optimizing all of your programs, your promotions, your product, all of those things towards who that ideal profile is. Being proactive is the kind of number one takeaway from, that agility conversation, like being, disruption proof. Proactive is the best medicine for instead of reaction, for making sure that you're ahead of the curve. And then lastly, kind of goes along with the first point, but to make sure that you can drive engagement at every stage to increase loyalty and reduce churn.
Yeah, I think that's right on. And what I would add is it's not just the responsibility of the marketing organization to do these things. When you're optimizing your programs, you can also optimize the product itself. A lot of times the issue is that the product's not designed for loyalty. It's not designed for engagement. It's designed for acquisition. So it's really everybody's job. But I think, the big nugget of focusing on loyalty is a very different way of looking at a business, to say we're trying to keep, we're not just trying to acquire people or hit a short-term number. We're trying to build relationships that drive recurring revenue. So loyalty becomes, even maybe more important than acquisition. It's truly the real engine of growth.
And somebody asked a question around defining ICP again. I think if we were to say 1-2 punch, that's really identifying your perfect customer. And Robbie, can you go through like your top 3 points just for how, like, what makes up that perfect customer?
Yeah. So what you really want is somebody who's going to get great value out of your offering for a long period of time and be willing and able to pay you for it. And you want to focus on their long-term goals. What is the reason that they came to you in the first place? I bought the blouse because I want to look professional when I'm speaking at work. And if you can help me look professional at work and solve that problem or achieve that goal more fully, I will be even more loyal to you. I would like nothing more than to give you some money every month and never have to worry about that again. So it's really thinking about what is the promise that underlies that purchase that you've already had with them.
And then one question that it's not really tied to ICP, but it's kind of that whole like starting motion. And this will probably be the last question. And then we'll get to any other questions that we didn't answer here. We will answer in a follow-up asset, just FYI. What advice do you have for startups that want to start with subscriptions but are still experimenting with pricing?
Yeah, so if you're just getting started and you're experimenting, if you're experimenting with the price of the subscription, you want to look at a couple of things. You want to look at what are your own costs? Do you have variable costs that you need to cover? You want to look at what the perceived value is for the offering that you have. If there are analogous offerings that people are going to anchor against when they look at yours. I think that those are some of the ways to start getting into the right pricing range. I tend to think that it's okay to not, you don't necessarily need to optimize every last dollar, but you need to be in a range where a customer says, this is what I see with most subscriptions. Yeah, I'm not even exactly sure what I'm paying. I don't know if it's $9.99 or $10.99 or $8.99, but I love it so much and it's so much a part of how I do things that I'm going to keep subscribing. That's kind of the mindset that you're going for. If you're worried about, a lot of times what the issue is, we're worried that we're going to price too low for this group or we need multiple tiers. I usually encourage organizations to start with a single tier and then layer in additional tiers as you identify segments that either need more or need less or need different. So don't start with 3 tiers because you don't know yet. Start with 1, and then based on what you learn, that's where I would encourage people to start layering in the other options.
Okay. We kind of did the questions related to this slide. Yeah. We have a bunch more questions that came in from before the webinar through the form, and then a couple more questions that are here that we didn't get to. So we want to, after this, we can maybe come together and put together a quick, quick shot answers to some of those questions, and then make sure that we're following up so that everybody gets, kind of what they were looking for out of the webinar. So Robbie, you and I will be connecting. And I want to say thank you to everyone for joining.
Yeah, thanks. This was a lot of fun. It's always good. It's always good to talk to you.
Thank you. You too. It's same. And I do want to just call out real quick for anybody, if you have any more questions or comments, you can always email me. We'll send out the deck afterwards, and you can also contact Robbie, so you'll have her email as well. So thanks again for joining, everybody, and we'll talk soon.